the hearing on Senate Bill 377. Amelia, will you give us an overview?
Morning, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Senate Bill number 377 concerns taxation and relates specifically to sales and compensating use taxes, income tax, privilege tax, and the property tax. I have provided you a short memorandum this morning to outline the provisions in the bill. We will start with sales and compensating use taxes. New section 1 of the bill, beginning on page 1, would establish a new 4-day back-to-school sales tax holiday during the first Thursday in August through the following Sunday, beginning in 2024. All back-to-school related sales during that time period of the following items that are listed would be exempt from the retailer sales tax. There are 4 categories listed. The first is clothing and clothing accessories or equipment with a sale price of $300 or less. Then school supplies, school instructional materials, or school art supplies with a sales price of $100 or less per item. Pre-written computer software with a sale price of $300 or less per item, and computers or school computer supplies with a sale price of $2,000 or less per item. The bill also contains definitions for purposes of this sales tax holiday, as well as administrative procedures. We're going to skip around a little bit in the bill because I've kind of tried to put similar tax areas together for your memorandum. So moving on to section 9, it would amend KSA 793603D to reduce the state rate of tax on food and food ingredients to 0% commencing April 1st of 2024. Currently, the rate is scheduled to change beginning January 1 of 2025. Sections 8, 11, 12, and 13 kind of go along with this provision. It would amend related statutes to increase the state highway fund percent of sales and compensating use tax revenue to 18% commencing April 1st of 2024. And that state highway fund percentage is scheduled to change January 1st of 2025 currently. Also, Section 10 would amend our current sales tax exemption statute 793606 to provide sales tax exemptions for all sales of children's diapers and feminine hygiene products beginning April 1st of 2024. Moving on to income tax provisions, Section 5 would amend 7932111C to increase the amount of tax credit for household and dependent care expenses from an amount equal to 25% of the taxpayer's federal tax credit to an amount equal to 50% of such federal tax credit, beginning with tax year 2024. Section 6 would amend KSA 7932117 to eliminate the income limit to qualify for the subtraction modification for Social Security income, also beginning with tax year 2024. And Section 7 would amend KSA 7932119 to increase the standard deduction for individuals beginning with tax year 2024. And I have provided to you there, it would increase the standard deduction for single individual filing status from $3,500 to $5,000, the married filing status from $8,000 to $10,000, and the head of household filing status from $6,000 to $7,500. There are provisions in the bill also relating to privilege tax. The bill would decrease the privilege tax rates on banks, trust companies, and savings and loan associations by reducing their normal tax rates. The bill would not amend their surtax rates. Section 3 specifically would amend KSA 791107 to reduce the normal rate on banks to 1.94% for tax year 2024 and 1.63% for 2025 and thereafter. And then Section 4 would amend 791108 for trust companies and savings and loan associations to reduce their normal rate to 1.93% for 2024 and 1.61% for tax year 2025 and all years thereafter. And then the last provision that I have here in my memorandum is the property tax provision. Section 2 of the bill would amend 79201X. This is the statute that currently exempts a portion of residential property valuation from the statewide school levy. This amendment would restate the extent of that exemption for 2023 at the current number of $42,049. And then it would increase the extent of the exemption to $100,000 of its appraised valuation beginning in tax year 2024. And this bill would eliminate the annual adjustment provision that is currently in the statute. And the bill would take effect from and after publication in the Kansas Register, and I would be happy to stand for questions.
Thank you, Amelia. Would you state that last statement, that last provision? It would remove.
Currently in 79201X, there is an annual adjustment that is applied to, I believe currently, let me look at the exact language. Currently, the language begins with a $40,000 exemption for 2022, I believe. And this would, I'm just looking for the exact. Yes, currently the exemption is $40,000 for tax year 2022, but then there is an annual adjustment provision. So then for tax year 2023, the annual adjustment applied, and the exemption for 2023 is currently $42,049. This bill would remove the annual adjustment language that's currently in the statute, but it would increase the extent to $100,000 beginning in tax year 2024 and thereafter. So there would no longer be an adjustment to that $100,000.
Thank you. Amelia, I just wanted to be clear that we would lose that inflationary index in this legislation for homeowners on tax relief. Committee, any other questions? Senator Peck.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. On that topic, I'm going to presume, without having read the however many page bill it is, 67-page bill, that there are not provisions in other sections as it relates to, or indexing provisions as it relates to the standard deduction, which is increased. And so there are no indexing, to your knowledge, as what we have currently, the legislature already put a stamp of approval on.
So
You follow the question.
I think I understand what you're getting at, Senator. Like in CCR 8, we had a indexing equation for the standard deduction. We lost that as a result of governor's veto. We did have indexing in other legislation too. Currently, the only indexing that it would be impacted with this bill would be the homeowners. There's no indexing for standard deduction or other policy that was included in our legislation.
There's none in current law, but there is in the legislation that's passed earlier in this session.
Absolutely. It was in the legislation the governor vetoed that would have indexed for inflation. So, yes.
And then one more question. I did notice briefly, and I apologize for being late, Madam Chairman, but it looks like that not only is the food sales tax moved to April the 1st, but the diapers, feminine hygiene products is also effective April 1st.
Yes, the sales tax exemption would begin April 1st of 2024 for children's diapers and feminine hygiene products.
Committee, Senator Baumgardner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just to kind of dovetail off that last question, when we look on page 63, and we look that it's addressed as children's diapers, but then diaper, there's a definition for that, but that would not include, because I have heard from some of our folks in our elderly community, that would not include them because they are not identified as children. Is that correct?
Amelia.
That is correct. The current language of this bill is children's diapers. And children's diapers, it means a diaper marketed to be worn by children.
But then when you look at the definition of diaper, that really could be applied to an individual with any health condition, any age. Just wanted to make sure we had that clarification. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Committee, any other questions? Senator Red.
So last time we had a question about, you had section 5, household and dependent care expenses. And I looked at the information I believe Eddie sent out about the definition of dependent services. So that's not just children under 13, it would be child services, but dependent is anybody that you're taking care of in your home, regardless of age, if there's a disability or they can't provide for themselves. So that means all of their expenses. Is that an accurate statement?
I am probably not prepared to answer that question today, as that is related to federal law, and I would need to go back and look at the federal provisions, because that's a fairly complex definition found in the federal tax code. So I'd have to go back and look at it.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. The information that was sent out as another document, 23 pages, it kind of defined it, because I was looking through what it would involve or include, and I think that was part of it. But I appreciate the response. Thank you.
Thank you. Committee, any other questions? Thank you, Amelia. Committee, our first conferee is Adam Profit. Welcome to the Tax Committee. Tell that this bill gets special attention. I don't think I've ever seen a 6-page fiscal note, so thank you.
You're welcome, Madam Chair. On fair disclosure, I did not write it, although I did review it and approve it, so there's a lot in there. Thank you, Madam Chair, for the opportunity to be here, members of the committee. My name is Adam Profit. I do have 2 roles, but I appear in front of you today strictly as the Director of the Budget, so I want to make sure I'm clear on which role I'm representing. And I'm testifying in support of Senate Bill 377 for a number of reasons, of which I'll get into over the course of my testimony. You have my written testimony in front of you, and it goes into much greater detail. I will try to be brief in the interest of time. I think there are others that can explain this far better than I. But this bill does provide significant and meaningful tax relief across the major tax types in Kansas. I'm going to spend my time focusing on property tax, sales tax, and income tax, and I will not spend any time talking about the other provisions, though I'm happy to answer questions. I'm also going to talk about the fiscal impact quite a bit and how we view this as sustainable over time and something that the budget can handle, not just this year, but in the out years. So the fiscal impact of this bill is about $450 million all funds in fiscal '25. There is some hit to the highway fund, but in the out years, it's about $300 million of SGF annually, and I'll talk about why I'm considering it SGF in just a moment. Due to the price tag, as I mentioned, it is meaningful tax relief, $300 million ongoing tax relief for taxpayers in Kansas, but also allows us to continue the work that we've been doing to stabilize the budget over the last few years and make sure that we can continue that work without risking the state's budget over time. We do have a large surplus right now. I will address that immediately. There's a large surplus, but when we build the budget and we look across time over the out years, what we're looking at is structural balance. And what I mean by structural balance is ensuring that ongoing revenues exceed ongoing expenditures, such that we're not using a current balance, getting down to zero, and then if we're structurally imbalanced, now we're getting below zero. So moving on to the provisions in here. On the income side, obviously this increases the standard deduction for tax filers in Kansas. It's a rather substantial increase. For those that are filing single, it's a 43% increase in the current standard deduction, moving from $3,500 to $5,000. For those married filing jointly or head of household, it's about a 25% increase. You'll notice that those percents are different, and that is because under current law, the deduction for single tax filers is less than half of that for those married filing jointly. So what we're trying to do is increase the standard deduction substantially, but also restore parity for single filers versus married filing jointly. This will provide about $90 million of relief to tax filers in fiscal '24, and then across the out years, it's about $70 million annually. It's important to note that over 75% of tax filers in Kansas utilized the standard deduction in Kansas in the most recently available tax year. So we're hitting a broad spectrum of taxpayers. Just a data point, so for those making between $50,000 and $75,000 a year, assuming this would be the only change to their taxes, they would see a savings of about $70 annually. And if you look across the income brackets, it's kind of a bell curve in terms of what the savings would be across tax brackets. So it'd be about $26 to $27 on the low end, peaking up to $70,000 in the middle income tax brackets, and then kind of tailing back off on the upper end tax brackets. So it's the bell curve, which is similar to the number of tax filers that we have in Kansas. Moving on to the Social Security side, this bill would eliminate the state level income tax on all Social Security income in the state of Kansas. As you well know, under current law, for taxpayers that earn under $75,000 of adjusted gross income, there is no income tax on Social Security income. Once they earn at $1 over $75,000, we tax the entirety of the Social Security income, creating a cliff. This tax would just eliminate that altogether, such that no taxpayers that earn Social Security income would have state income taxes on Social Security. We anticipate this being about $120 million annual savings to those that are earning Social Security over time. Moving on towards residential property taxes. So as was stated by Amelia, this does increase the current exemption for the 20 mills tax from the current level of $42,000 up to $100,000 a year. It does not have the indexing that's in the current law, but it is about 150% increase over the current exemption. So it's really just ramping up to a substantial level. We estimate this will save taxpayers and homeowners about $100 a year in perpetuity on this particular tax type. It's also of note that about 370,000 homes across Kansas will pay $20 or less for this particular property tax. Total savings for this one is about $85 million a year in fiscal '24. And it hovers around the $80 to $85 million a year for the out years as we move forward. I do want to note that the reduction in revenues on this is not a reduction in SGF revenues. This mill, the revenues from this mill goes into a school mill levy tax fund, but we use that to fund the school finance formula. So we are calling this an SGF expenditure because absent the SGF backfill for the reduction of those revenues, we would not be in compliance with the school finance formula. So although it doesn't reduce SGF revenues, it does increase SGF expenditures. So we're contemplating that as an SGF hit. On the sales tax side, as was stated, this would pull forward the elimination of the state level sales tax on groceries in Kansas, go to 0% on 4/1/24. We would use the current surplus to cover the cost of that between 4/1 and 1/1/25 as the out year reduction is already baked into the revenue forecast. It does add diapers and feminine hygiene products to this. They would also be effective 4/1/24 from being exempt from the state level income sales tax. That would carry a fiscal note of about $8 million across the out years. Additionally, we're proposing a back-to-school sales tax holiday that would be about 4 days. Starting this August, it'd be the first full weekend of August every year. There are a number of states that have this holiday in place. Missouri is one of those, so if you live near the Missouri state line, you might notice an outflow of people going across the state line to purchase back-to-school stuff during their holiday. This would save parents and those going back to school about $5 million annually. So just to recap briefly, we do view this as meaningful tax relief, $450 million of total savings to Kansans in fiscal '24, approximately $300 million of savings to Kansans across all these tax types for all of the out years. Again, making sure that it's sustainable over time. If you start with a GBR, which is everything that we start with, we start when we're building the budget, we look at the GBR and then we look at what the out years are going to be. We make sure that any level of tax relief we're putting in there is going to be sustainable over time as the governor is looking at that budget. We still have some things to do within the budget. We've done a very, very good job of stabilizing it and undoing some of the maneuvers that were done in the past. We've paid down a lot of debt. We still carry a relatively high debt load relative to our neighbors, so still want to make sure that we can get after some of those provisions so that we can reduce taxes in future years once that debt is off our books. And again, we have a tendency to look at structural balance. And again, when I say structural balance, that's ongoing revenues versus ongoing expenditures. Structural balance is a measure of where you're going to be across time. And this allows us to have a little bit of cushion in the budget should something happen with revenues over the next couple of years to make sure that we're not getting too out of whack and that we can adjust accordingly. And with that, Madam Chair, I would be happy to stand for questions.
Thank you.
At the appropriate time.
I have several questions. I'm sure committee members do too. So committee questions? Senator Baumgardner and Senator Peck.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Adam, for being here. Let's talk a little bit about the back-to-school sales holiday. Why would we schedule that for the very same weekend as Missouri?
Madam Chair, if I may, thank you for the question. It's the most reasonable time to go. School has been starting earlier and earlier every year, so rather than waiting and having our own time and trying to do it on a different holiday, take advantage of folks that are being out and getting back to school supplies. I will tell you that during my tenure in the private sector, I worked for a retail organization at the corporate headquarters. We did track every single state what the timing of their back-to-school sales holidays were, and we made sure that we had product appropriately placed in those stores because we did see a measurable impact. So if Missouri's going to do theirs at that same time, specifically along the eastern edge of Kansas, we want to make sure that we're keeping that business in the state of Kansas for our local retailers.
And if I might, Madam Chair, the interesting thing is putting it that first weekend actually contradicts testimony that we had last year. The ask was that it not be a first weekend because the first of the month is when families are having to make house payments and other major payments. And the concern was not having the funds to even take advantage of that. The other issue that was brought up was oftentimes schools have a list of items, but when the child actually goes to school that first week, not with their suitcase full of items, they find out what they really need, and the ask was to wait until after school had started so that they could go and actually acquire the things that were needed. So, little concerned about the timing in particular. I would, in fact, one of the things that this committee discussed last year is why limit it to one weekend to accommodate that. And so from the standpoint, do we know what other states that are connected to Kansas, other contingent states, do we know what their holiday is? Because Missouri's been the first weekend of August for some time now.
Madam Chair, if I may, thank you for the question. I don't have that information available right now, but my staff is here and they'll write down that question, and I will commit to answering that question by the end of this week.
I think we need to look at that. The other item is exactly what I had mentioned and asked our revisor with regard to why would we only be focusing on, when you look at the definition of diaper, why are we only looking at the expense for families with young children? Why are we ignoring the needs of those with medical issues, our elderly, and our veterans as well? So have you done a run on what that would be for that tax exemption if in fact we were to look at the true definition that's provided and eliminate the child in the definition?
Sure, Madam Chair, thank you for the question again. I have not done the run. Again, all the run has been focused on the contents of this bill. So happy to, again, take that back. And if we're able to get the information by Friday, we'll do that as well. But if not, we'll get it as soon as humanly possible.
But where did this bill generate from?
It was during the course of a host of discussions over the previous several months with multiple individuals, and kind of came to a consensus as we were negotiating a compromise position.
Okay. And I would just like to point out, Madam Chair, one of the things that, at least so far in this legislative session, what we have tried to do is how can we address the needs of all Kansans? Not just this little group, not just a part of that group, but the overall needs of all Kansans. And so I would prefer that we not be myopic and that we are looking at how definitions truly meet the needs of Kansans. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Well, thank you. And I would just say that I wasn't contacted. I don't think anybody on the committee, maybe one or two. Actually, nobody on this committee was contacted in the negotiations on that tax bill. I'd just like to point that out. And most of these provisions we have seen before, we have looked at as a legislature, so we appreciate that. Yes. Senator Peck.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'm not going to, but I could ask a lot of questions on this legislation, but I will point out something and ask a question of the director, since you are apparently the lead proponent on the legislation. On the quote, back-to-school sales or back-to-school related sales, there are a lot of items that are not related to back-to-school at all. That's just a comment. But the question, in the back-to-school sales tax, if you look at X, it is diapers, children and adult, including disposable diapers. So apparently, if this legislation were to pass, adult diapers would be exempt for 4 days a year, and baby diapers would be exempted year-round. So adults should stock up on diapers during that first weekend in August. Is that a correct statement? The first part, not the last part about the.
Yeah, I don't want to answer the question, if you don't mind, sir, if I may, Madam Chair. That would be a correct statement under the current definitions. As I mentioned to the previous senator, we're more than happy to look at the fiscal note would be for adding adult diapers on a year-round basis. And if the committee makes a decision, then we'll review that at that time.
So my final question, and it relates to the back to school. I noticed that it exempts blackboard chalk. I don't think the schools hardly use blackboard chalk, but it doesn't have whiteboards and markers, which is what most schools use. I'm guessing that you would be amendable or maybe not, because this might take us out of compliance with the streamline to amending that, or you don't necessarily want to accommodate modern whiteboards, but you do old-fashioned blackboards?
Madam Chair, I appreciate the question. The way we developed the back-to-school sales tax holiday was with a focus on making sure that we are streamlined sales compliant. I do not know what would happen to the streamlined compliance. I'd have to defer to my friends at Revenue if we started adding other items that aren't a part of that. But the focus was, again, making sure that we're streamlined compliant so we're able to do this efficiently and effectively.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Like I said, I could ask more, but I'll stand down. We've got a lot of individuals to hear from today.
Thank you, Senator. Committee, any other questions? Senator Holland.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Adam, thanks for being here today. Just a couple questions.
Excuse me, really quickly. Would you mind emailing the responses to John so that he can distribute it to the
Yes, ma'am, I
committee?
will.
Thank you. Senator, please proceed.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. So just a couple questions, Madam Chair. So talk to me, how did the privilege rate tax reduction make it into this bill? What was the policy thinking behind including that in this bill?
Yeah, Madam Chair, thank you for the question, Senator. As stated on a previous question, this was a compromise bill across multiple individuals, and this was identified as a need through the course of negotiations. So it made its way into the bill as part of that compromise.
You don't have any information on the background of why this was offered up or put in the bill specifically?
I don't want to get over my skis here, but what I've heard is, there was a reduction in the corporate tax rate, and this would be commensurate with that. I don't know if that was the reason behind that, but that's what came up during discussions.
I guess I was, Madam Chair, just curious, this was something that fell between the cracks from the Project Apex, and because the corporates got theirs and the banks didn't get theirs, and I was kind of curious if that was the catch-all for that. So can you comment, or doesn't matter? Okay. And then one other question, Adam, just kind of a question. So definitely that is some substantive property tax relief for our residential homeowners under the proposal you have as far as involving the state property tax and the school finance levy. I guess my question is just, and this is more theoretical, we've had a lot of debates the past 3 or 4 years about basically property taxes. And I, for one, have been particularly concerned about residential property taxes. And I'm curious does the administration have any thoughts or opinions on, does this proposal here in the governor's tax bill, would this be considered like a long-term fix or a short-term fix to basically the ever-burgeoning residential property tax pressures our citizens are facing?
Madam Chair, and thank you for the question, Senator. This was a solution that was identified to produce both immediate and meaningful tax relief to all all property owners across the state. Again, it's a 150% increase from the current exemption. It provides upwards of $100 to $115 of immediate relief for every homeowner that would meet this exemption. So to the extent that it's long-term, obviously we can review the effectiveness and efficacy of this program over time, but this is what landed in the bill and what we would support right now.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Committee, any other questions? Senator Erickson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for your presentation. Just a quick question. You say in your testimony that this plan is sustainable for the state, and it is without introducing budgetary risk to the out years. Based on, do we have runs for that, and how much could we sustain in tax cuts for Kansans and still provide the structural balance you spoke of? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yeah, Madam Chair. Senator, thank you for the question. I'll go ahead and pull the curtain back and get well into the weeds. As we sit down with the governor every year and review the budget, as she's constructing the budget for the upcoming legislative session, we always look out 3, 4, 5, 6 years. Obviously, you're making some assumptions in the out years, right? So our starting point was using the revenue estimates that are official through fiscal '25. And then we also use the governor's budget recommendation because that is the starting point by which the legislature starts to debate budgets, right? So that's the most official that we have. We then just carry out those into the out years and make some hopefully conservative assumptions on those. We use a 2.5% growth rate on revenues. We assume that the school finance formula is going to carry on in perpetuity. Just very basic assumptions without adding any new spending or any new policies in the out years. So we went out several years, and this was the spot that we felt comfortable, given everything else that's in the governor's budget recommendation, to include the restoring of the $54 million in LAVTRF. So when we look at a tax package, you combine this $300 million over time, plus the $54 million that's in LAVTRF as additional tax. You couple that with the food sales tax reduction that once that's fully implemented, that's another it's a total of $500 million over time. That's $850 million-ish of revenues that we've reduced over the past couple of years. And that's the level that would sustain us through the time that which we were looking.
Senator Baumgartner.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for bringing up the LOVTRF. So when you were going through that analysis, was the assumption that LOVTRF would be funded and that counties would reduce or hold firm their mill and not increase it? Or was it that they would continue to increase it as they have been all of these years?
Yeah, Madam Chair, thank you for the question, Senator. Let me clarify my statement on that. I know that there was a bill heard on LVTRF on January 11th, I believe, while I was giving the budget presentation. Our assumptions were not for that bill. And the governor's budget recommendation was, what she did was just reinstate the $54 million transfer. So that's the only change that she's made in state statute. It would stay at $54 million, it would carry in perpetuity, and the funding split across the counties would remain at a 65%, 35% split. So no other provisions other than what is already currently in law, just lifting the suspension of what's in law right now.
So I want to be clear on what you just said. The governor did not support the LAVTR bill that we had the hearing on. She is supporting the lower amount, the $54 million. Is that correct?
We took no position on the other bill. That her governor's budget recommendation included reinstating the $54 million that's in statute.
Okay, but she is choosing the lower amount of the LAVTR language that is in statute.
That is what is in her GBR.
That's fine. Okay, thank you.
One last follow-up question. When you were looking at the state's obligation for roughly 60% of the SGF being K through 12 funding, were you looking at the obligation that is status quo, where we are looking back 2 years and paying for students that are no longer in districts, or were you looking at what was vetoed, line item vetoed last year, but it would be current enrollment or 1 year look back as an option?
Yeah, Madam.
So I'm going to allow the question, but we're going to have to get back on the tax bill.
Yeah.
I understand the budget director's before us. Maybe we'll have you back another day on the budget, but
If I may, just very simply, we use current law plus the GBR. So we would use current law, which has the 2-year look back
Thank you.
for everything.
committee, any other questions on the bill? I do have a couple of them. One of them, I'm very glad to see the Social Security cuts in there. That is legislation that the Senate's passed, 3, 4 years now? So we have been fighting diligently for that. I'm glad to see that legislation in there. Also, the Senate had included cuts. We have passed exempting all retirement accounts from state income tax. Can you speak to why that provision wasn't in the bill, or a piece of buying it down at some time? It has been in provisions previously put across the governor's desk, and she's rejected.
Yeah, Madam Chair, thank you for the question. And specific to the Social Security cuts, you might recall last year the governor introduced a bill that would smooth the cliff. Heard feedback loud and clear that the preference is to eliminate Social Security tax altogether. That's where we landed on this one. As it relates to other retirement accounts, there was no consideration given to it this year. Again, I spoke to the parameters under which we were trying to stay with the $300 to $350 million, including the LVTRF. So candidly, I didn't even do the runs on those. Seeing runs from previous years, I believe the price tag was relatively high, but I would have to go back to look at those to make sure.
It was, we had worked out a compromise so that we bought it down 10,000 a year. But yeah, it would be nice if the governor would consider that too in her provisions. Also, there are no provisions in this bill that fight or help budget against inflation. Why was that?
Can I ask a do you mean no indexing versus COLA? Is that what you're?
There's none.
Yeah, so
In
again,
fact, they stripped the language that this body had passed and was signed into law on the homeowners' inflation and valuation increase. So they went the opposite way with this legislation.
thank you, Madam Chair, I appreciate that. And I think it was maybe Senator Holland that asked the question about property tax. It's, again, the current level being 42,000 with the provision that was law. It would take a long time to get to 100. So the focus was on getting as high as we could, as fast as we could by getting to 100. Same on the standard deduction increase, showing the 25% increase there, which again would have taken time with those. That's the best answer I can give, that there's substantial increases versus current law, so it's immediate. If the committee wants to look at that, we're happy to look at runs.
So, and I appreciate that. This committee actually considered the legislation at 100,000 in 2022. I don't know if you're familiar with that. And so we landed on an increase of 40,000 with the inflation adjustment because we were being diligent with the runs and considering it. Because of the amount in the coffers, we definitely are at 100,000 now, including the inflation increase. So, committee, any other questions? I do appreciate your work on this, hoping that we can get some great policy for Kansans.
Thank you for your time, Madam Chair. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Committee, our next conferee is Donna Ginther. Welcome to the Tax Committee.
Let's see if I can get this situated for my height. Thank you for having me here. I'd like to talk to you today about Senate Bill 377. I'm providing positive testimony. A little bit of background about myself. I was the academic advisor to the Governor's Tax Reform Council and the Institute for Policy and Social Research that I direct, authored a report on, a final report on the activities of that Tax Reform Council, in which three major considerations or recommendations were made by members of the council, several of whom are in the room. The council strongly endorsed the food tax proposal. It endorsed expanding the 20,000 homestead exemption from the statewide mill levy and expanding the standard deduction to provide additional income tax relief. Senate Bill 377 enacts key aspects of these recommendations, and my testimony is overwhelmingly positive. I'm going to turn to different provisions within the bill, starting with the sales tax. So we are well on our way to axing the food tax. We're still paying 2%. Other states around us, Oklahoma has a higher tax rate. The problem with food sales tax and taxation on diapers and feminine hygiene products are that these are necessary goods for survival, and they're very regressive. So a low-income household will spend about 29% of its income on food, while a high-income household spends about 6 to 8%. So eliminating the tax on food, diapers, and feminine hygiene products will be good for all households in the state of Kansas, regardless of how you define diapers. I think that, a more inclusive definition, given Senator Baumgartner's issues, I think would be warranted. I'm neutral on the back-to-school sales tax holiday because that shifts expenditures from when they would be made, maybe after the first week of school, to before school starts. It doesn't really do anything to support economic growth, and as an economist, I'm very interested in what we can do to make our state growth-friendly. However, on the other side, and the reason I'm neutral is because our competitor states, Missouri has a similar program, and we know with no geographic barrier, a lot of people cross state lines to take advantage of that opportunity. In terms of increasing the school levy on property tax exemptions, this makes a lot of sense. In our estimates that I'll show you in a bit, anybody who owns a house over $100,000 will get over $100 in tax cuts, and this is well warranted. I want to talk a bit more about the standard deduction, and if you look at my testimony table 1, you see that Kansas has one of the lowest standard deductions of our surrounding states. Iowa doesn't have any standard deduction. We couple that with a personal exemption. And analysis of income tax data showed that about 75% of Kansas taxpayers use the standard deduction. And those that itemize is really skewed towards the richest taxpayers. Our estimates show that 50% of those earning between $100,000 and $250,000 itemize, and about 78% of those earning more than $250,000 itemize. So what increasing the standard deduction does is it gives every taxpayer in the center of the distribution, where you have the majority of your taxpayers, getting a tax cut. Those who earn $250,000 or more in the state of Kansas are just 4% of our taxpayers. I am neutral on the Social Security tax, income tax elimination. We do have a Social Security tax cliff that needs to be addressed. I'm concerned about the price. And this tax cut disproportionately affects 93,000 households in the state of Kansas. That's 7% of our population. I'm also positive on doubling the child and dependent tax credit. I called the daycare provider in Lawrence, Kansas, where I sent my children. My children are now teenagers, so they don't need daycare. To put an infant in daycare in Lawrence, Kansas is $15,000 a year. To put a toddler in daycare, it's close to $14,000 a year. In-state tuition at KU is $11,000, and at K-State, it's close to $11,000. So people in the state of Kansas are paying more for childcare than they are for in-state tuition. And this provision doubles the federal tax credit. And for those who have children receiving childcare, it's about a $300 cut in taxes. Now, one of the things we did for the Tax Council was create hypothetical taxpayers. In Figure 1, we create a hypothetical taxpayer. These are married households. Some have no children. We set their income. And what we do is we actually do their taxes using the Kansas tax code and then add in the provisions of this bill. Now, we looked at what we're modeling are the standard deduction. And for our households, married households with no kids to senior households, it's about $100 to $114 tax cut. And then we add in the sales tax benefits and the child tax credit. And for senior households, this elimination of the Social Security income tax. So for married couple households with no children, you get about a $400 tax cut, adding all these provisions together. For a married couple household with 2 children, and all of these are homeowners, and 1 child in diapers and 2 children in daycare, they're getting over $800 in tax cuts. And for our senior households, it's between $1,500 to $1,800 in tax cuts. I want to finish my tax testimony by talking about guidelines for sound tax policy and what we learned. Figure 2 is from the Governor's Council on Tax Reform final report. The dashed line is revenue, and the solid line is expenditures. And when you had tax cuts like you did under Governor Brownback, expenditures exceeded revenues. And given the provision of the state balanced budget, there were a lot of cuts that resulted in raiding the Bank of KDOT and things of that nature. Now, the tax cuts were well-meaning in under Governor Brownback. They wanted to stimulate economic growth. So economists have studied whether or not it had the intended impact. And what we found was that what economists have found, and this is not me, these are other researchers who have looked closely at what the state did, they found no evidence that they resulted in increased economic activity. And found no evidence that it increased employment. They found that the tax cuts simply gave benefits to very wealthy individuals and did not have the intended consequences. So these are things to keep in mind, and one of the reasons why I support this bill, because at a $300 million out-year estimated cost, I think it's something that we can afford while still having resources to deal with economic shocks as well as expenditures required by the state. I'm open to any questions that you might have.
Thank you. Committee, I know we have questions. I do have a couple. And just so everybody knows, we are going to run out of time, so I'm going to continue the hearing tomorrow. And is there anybody that's out of state or out of area that would need to travel that we need to have testify next? Okay, we will continue the hearing tomorrow, but let's go ahead with questions today. I do have a couple of quick ones that you mentioned, and I appreciate your comments very much. The tax cliff that you talked about with Social Security, we also have that tax cliff with low-income earners right now. I don't know if you are aware of that. Are you aware of that?
There's an income threshold
There
where,
is a cliff.
yeah,
that you
where they
may-
start to pay taxes.
Yes.
So we have actually simulated for low-income households in our tax report that, there are also benefits such as the earned income tax credit for those low-income households. And so when you factor that in, the tax cliff is not as sharp as it is for the senior households.
Okay, but the bill that the governor vetoed actually eliminated the cliff and took over 340,000 Kansas low-income taxpayers to zero income tax. So it completely removed the cliff. It completely helped the low-income individuals. And I just, that's one of my major concerns. Another comment that you made is that the fiscal note, what I have in front of me is FY25 is $439 million, not the 300 that everybody keeps talking about. So it is.
So, yeah, I understand that things are
The numbers matter.
Things are front-loaded in the first year.
They absolutely.
So 400 of 3 billion is a percentage. We do have a surplus. So
Right, I just want to make it clear. And another comment you made was axe the tax. And I know that terminology is being used, the food tax, but I have constituents who are going to the grocery store and they're having a receipt and they're like, I thought we went to zero sales tax on food. That's not quite accurate. We went to zero sales tax on groceries, non-prepared foods, and only state sales tax, not local tax. I know, but consumers are expecting zero sales tax on their food, and I just want to be clear. I know the Senate passed removing all sales tax, and just so that it was accurate on the X. I'm not sure, I just want the terminology to be, we don't need to mislead the public, we need to be accurate. Yes, it was great that those sales tax are reduced and will be gone, hopefully sooner than 2025, but
I think we agree on that. I should have said axe the state food tax.
say state grocery
State, yeah.
tax. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, because we're still paying sales tax on food, prepared foods. Committee, any questions? Senator Blasey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Donna, can you help me please go back and clarify something for me? On the child care tax credit, you said if it's doubled, as in the plan, which was also in the CCR that was passed by the legislature, you're saying that families will save $300?
We estimate, so if you have a child in daycare, we took survey of consumer expenditure data for the state of Kansas, or for the region, and we looked at daycare expenditures, and then we saw how much they would get, and then we calculated it going to 50%. And so we estimate, based on these assumptions, what people are spending right now, that if you have 2 children in daycare, you will get a $300 tax cut.
I would love to see some runs on that, if I could, by research. That seems higher than what I think it calculates to, because I think the federal level is set at a certain amount.
We're happy to share our numbers, but
great.
those are, whenever you're doing these estimates, you are layering in assumptions about expenditures for sales tax and child tax credits. Yeah.
Appreciate that. And then my other question, so the CCR that was passed by the legislature for joint filers for a family with 2 children, just based on the income provisions in the bill, and I know there's some differences between this bill and that bill, the CCR was going to cut taxes for about $400 for a family making $30,000, whereas the governor's plan in this bill is only $62. So the CCR that was passed by the legislature is actually going to cut, I guess, almost 8 times more, 7 times more money, or 7 times more taxes for low-income earners.
Well, so again, when you figure out what's going on with low-income earners, you have to figure out not only their tax cuts, but as well, you need to figure out the earned income tax credit, which Kansas is very generous with. So that's one issue I'd want to call to your attention. We did not do estimates of the CCR. We are just doing the governor's bill. If you would like me to do similar estimates where we layer in these assumptions and come up with a total tax package, we could do that. Probably not in 24 hours.
So will you be able to return tomorrow?
I could return tomorrow, yes.
At 9:30, because there's quite a few.
I have to teach at 11, so I could come and testify and run.
Thank you very much. It's much appreciated, because we do want to fully vet this. We want to get the best possible legislation for Kansans, so much appreciated. Committee, we are going to continue the hearing tomorrow. Since everybody's here, I do have 2 bill requests. I have RS 2883. It is removing the age limit on the Homestead 2 property tax freeze. Any questions? Any objections? Seeing none, we'll make the request. The second request is RS 2884. It is addressing the issue of locals electing a school bond and tax exemptions as a result of them voting for the bond. Any questions? Any objection? Seeing none, we'll make the request. Committee, we will continue the hearing tomorrow at 9:30. Any other